It began in July 1965. A girl, bright as morning sun, with a missing tooth and a heart that loved beyond her own pain, stepped into a home she believed would protect her. By October, that same home had become a dungeon, and the girl, a hollowed echo of herself. This is not just a story of abuse. This is the story of a community that closed its doors, of innocence shattered, and of cruelty left unchecked. Her name was Sylvia Likens. She was 16 years old, and this is her truth. Born on January 3, 1949, Sylvia Marie Likens came into the world between two sets of fraternal twins, Danielle and Diana before her, Benny and Jenny after. Sylvia was the middle child, but she was more than just one of five. She was the glue. Protective, radiant, and quietly resilient. She was nicknamed Cookie for her sweetness, and was known for her long wavy light brown hair and kind demeanor. Sylvia was known to be protective and nurturing toward Jenny, who had survived polio and walked with a limp. Their closeness was evident in everyday moments, like Sylvia helping Jenny skate or walk with her leg brace. She loved music, particularly the Beatles, and dreamed about California, where she once lived for a time. In her teenage years, Sylvia occasionally earned spending money by babysitting, running errands, or performing ironing chores for friends and neighbors, often giving her mother part of her earnings. Sylvia had lost her front tooth in a roughhousing match with her brothers as a young child. Since then, she became self-conscious. She'd laugh with her lips pressed together, never full-bodied. Even Joy had learned to be polite. Her parents, Lester and Betty, were carnival workers. They traveled across Indiana, selling candy and soda in summer fairs. The Likens sons regularly traveled with them in order to assist with their job, but Sylvia and Jenny were discouraged from doing the same, out of concern for their safety and education. As a result, both sisters frequently stayed with their relatives, often their grandmother. The oldest, Diana, was grown and married. Lester and Betty's marriage was fraught with financial stress and legal troubles. By June 1965, Sylvia and Jenny Likens resided with their parents in Indianapolis. On July 3rd, their mother was arrested and subsequently jailed for shoplifting. With Betty in jail and Lester's travel schedule, the girls needed a temporary guardian. That's when they were introduced to Gertrude Baniszewski, the woman who promised to treat them like her own. First, let's talk about Gertrude's life before Sylvia Likens. Gertrude Baniszewski, also known as Gertrude Wright and the Torture Mother, was born on September 19, 1928 Indianapolis, Indiana, to Hugh Marcus Van Fossen Sr. and Molly Myrtle, both of whom were originally from Illinois and were of English and Dutch descent. Gertrude was the third of 6 children, and her family was working class. On October 5, 1939, Gertrude saw her 50-year-old father die from a sudden heart attack. 6 years later, she dropped out of high school at age 16 to marry 18-year-old John Stephan Baniszewski. They had 4 children. Although John had a volatile temper and occasionally beat his wife, the two remained together for 10 years prior to their first divorce. Following her divorce, Gertrude married a man named Edward Guthrie. This marriage lasted just 3 months before the couple divorced. Shortly thereafter, Gertrude remarried her first husband, with whom she had 2 more children. The couple divorced for the second time in 1963. Weeks after her third divorce, Gertrude began a relationship with a 20-year-old welder named Dennis Lee Wright, who also physically abused her. She had 1 child with Wright. Shortly after the birth of their son in May 1964, Wright abandoned Gertrude. Shortly thereafter, Gertrude filed a paternity suit against Wright for financial support of their child, but Wright seldom contributed to the care of their son. By 1965, Gertrude lived alone with her 7 children: 17-year-old Paula, 15-year-old Stephanie, 12-year-old John, 11-year-old Marie, 10-year-old Shirley, 8-year-old James, and 1-year-old Dennis Lee Wright Jr. Although she was 36 years old and 5 feet 6 inches in height, she weighed only 100 pounds and has been described as a haggard, underweight asthmatic, chain smoker suffering from clinical depression due to the stress of 3 failed marriages, a failed relationship, and a recent miscarriage. In addition to the sporadic checks she received from her first husband, a former Indianapolis policeman, upon whom she primarily relied financially to support her children, Gertrude occasionally performed odd jobs for neighbors and acquaintances, such as sewing or cleaning, in order to earn money. Gertrude resided in Indianapolis at 3850 East New York Street, where the monthly rent was $55. Okay, now back to July 4th, 1965. Sylvia and Ginny started to live with Gertrude, with the understanding that Gertrude would receive weekly boarding fees of $20 to take care of Sylvia and Ginny until Lester returned to collect them in November of that year. The first 2 weeks of Sylvia and Ginny's life at the Baniszewski home went relatively well. They attended high school and attended teenage social functions with the Baniszewski children, as well as church with Gertrude on Sunday. When Lester's $20 payment failed to arrive, though, Gertrude threw a temper tantrum, screaming at the girls, saying things like, "I took care of you two bitches for nothing," before forcing them to lie across her bed with their skirts and underwear around their ankles while Gertrude beat their buttocks. The next week, Sylvia and Ginny went through the neighborhood garbage, collecting old Coca-Cola bottles to sell in order to get money for candy. When they came home with the candy, Gertrude accused them of stealing. When Sylvia explained how she had gotten the candy, Gertrude accused her of lying and made her bend over her bed, as before, while she beat her across the buttocks with a paddle. On one occasion, in late August, both girls were beaten approximately 15 times on the back with the aforementioned paddle, after Paula, Gertrude's eldest daughter, accused the sisters of eating too much food at a church supper the household children had attended. On another occasion, as the family ate supper, Gertrude, Paula, and a neighborhood boy named Randy Gordon Lepper, who was 10 years old, force-fed Sylvia a hot dog overloaded with condiments, including mustard and spices. Sylvia vomited as a result, and was later forced to consume what she had regurgitated. The incident which made Gertrude specifically target Sylvia occurred in late August, when she overheard Sylvia's remark that she had once lain under the covers with a boy. Gertrude inexplicably burst into a fit of obscenities, accused Sylvia of being a prostitute, and informed the rest of the house that Sylvia was pregnant because she had let a boy touch her. Gertrude then attacked Sylvia, repeatedly kicking her in the genitals. Paula, herself 3 months pregnant, and also jealous of Sylvia's physical appearance, then participated in attacking Sylvia, knocking her off her chair and onto the kitchen floor, shouting, "You ain't fit to sit in a chair." From there on, Gertrude only allowed Sylvia to sit in a chair with permission. The day after Gertrude kicked Sylvia in genitals, according to Ginny, as an act of vengeance, Sylvia and Ginny told their classmates that they had seen Paula and Stephanie having sex with boys in exchange for money. When Stephanie's 15-year-old boyfriend, Coy Hubbard, discovered what Sylvia and Ginny had said, he came to the Baniszewski home and beat Sylvia. From then on, Hubbard, encouraged by Gertrude, made frequent visits to the Baniszewski home, during which she would instruct the boy to practice his judo on Sylvia. Also around this time, Gertrude got Sylvia's best friend, 13-year-old named Anna Cisco, alone long enough to convince her that Sylvia had been telling boys at school that Anna's mother was a whore. When Gertrude took Anna to see Sylvia, she directed Anna in a violent attack on the girl. Soon after, Gertrude told one of Paula's friends, a girl named Judy Duke, that Sylvia had been spreading rumors about her mother and pitted the girls against each other in a fist fight. During the fight, Gertrude instructed Ginny to punch Sylvia. When Ginny refused, Gertrude began to beat her in the face with her fists until Ginny finally agreed to punch Sylvia. In July and August, both Lester and Betty would occasionally return to Indianapolis to visit their daughters, whenever their travel schedule afforded them the opportunity. The last occasion Lester and Betty visited their daughters was on October 5th. On this occasion, neither girl exhibited any visible sign of distress about their mistreatment to their parents. This was likely because both were in the presence of Gertrude and her children. Almost immediately after Lester and Betty had left the Baniszewski household on their final visit, Gertrude turned to face Sylvia and stated, "What are you going to do now, Sylvia? Now they're gone." In August of 1965, the vacant house next door to the Baniszewski residence was purchased by a middle-aged couple named Phyllis and Raymond Vermillion. The Vermillions arranged a backyard barbecue so that the two families could get to know one another. During the course of the barbecue, Phyllis noticed Sylvia wandering around the yard with a pronounced black eye. Paula proudly announced to Phyllis that she was the one who had given it to her. Then, under Gertrude's supervision, Paula approached Sylvia with a glass of steaming water and threw it in Sylvia's face. Neither of the Vermillions reported this incident to the authorities. 2 months later, Phyllis went to the Gertrude home to borrow something. Over the course of the few minutes she was there, she noticed Sylvia wandering around as in a daze with swollen lips and a black eye that had swollen shut. To demonstrate how this had happened, Paula took her belt off and began to beat Sylvia with it in front of Phyllis. Phyllis again neglected to report anything to the authorities. Around the time that Phyllis Vermillion witnessed Paula beat Sylvia, Sylvia came home from school and told Gertrude that she needed a sweatsuit for gym class. When Gertrude told Sylvia that they could not afford one, Sylvia stole one from the school. Gertrude questioned Sylvia about her new gym outfit, eventually coercing Sylvia into confession. Gertrude inexplicably segued from the topic of Sylvia stealing into the topic of Sylvia being a prostitute, and threw Sylvia onto the ground, where she repeatedly kicked her in the genitals before once more returning to the topic of theft. To cure Sylvia of her sticky fingers, Gertrude burned the tips of each of Sylvia's fingers with a lit cigarette. Afterwards, she made Sylvia bend over while she whipped her with a belt. After this incident, the smokers in the Baniszewski home began arbitrarily putting their cigarettes out on Sylvia's body as a reminder for her not to steal. Sometime later, Sylvia went out again to sell old soda bottles for money. When she returned home, Gertrude accused her of prostitution. Gertrude took her into the living room of her home and forced Sylvia to strip naked in front of her sons and several neighborhood boys, on the threat of beating Jenny. Once Sylvia was fully naked, Gertrude handed her a glass Coca-Cola bottle and forced Sylvia to masturbate with it for the boys. Following the Coke bottle incident, Sylvia became incontinent. As a result, Gertrude decided that she was no longer fit to live with humans and locked her in the basement. The lack of a toilet in the basement forced Sylvia to defecate and urinate on the floor. During this period, Gertrude took on 14-year-old Ricky Hobbs, a neighborhood boy, as her personal assistant when dealing with Sylvia. Hobbs, an honor student from a middle-class family with no previous legal trouble, experienced a sudden shift in personality upon becoming Gertrude's assistant, blindly following whatever orders she gave him. Crime reporters have since speculated that Hobbs was Gertrude's lover and that she had seduced the boy into becoming her henchman. Gertrude's children turned Sylvia into a money-making opportunity, charging neighborhood children a nickel to gawk at the nude Sylvia or to push her down the stairs to the basement, where she was now kept when not being bathed or put on display. She was kept constantly naked and rarely fed. When she was allowed to eat, it was in some bizarre fashion often. Gertrude and her 12-year-old son John Jr. would make Sylvia clean the basement by allowing her to eat her own feces, and gave Sylvia a container in which she could collect her urine, which she was then made to drink. Sometime around this period, Jenny managed to send contact to her and Sylvia's older sister, Diana, who was married and had a family of her own. Jenny outlined the horrors that she and Sylvia were experiencing and instructed Diana to contact the police to come rescue them. Diana ignored the letter, believing that Jenny was simply displeased with being punished and that she was making up stories so that she could come live with her. Shortly after this, Diana came by to visit her sisters. Gertrude refused to allow her into the home, at first telling her that Lester had contacted her and instructed her not to allow Diana into the home. When Diana questioned this, Gertrude threatened to call the police and have her arrested for trespassing. Diana hid nearby the house until she spotted Jenny outside and then approached her. Jenny told her older sister that she was not allowed to talk to her and then ran away. Concerned, Diana contacted social services. When a social worker arrived at the home, Gertrude informed her that she had kicked Sylvia out of the house for being physically unclean and a prostitute, and that Sylvia had since run away. Gertrude then managed to get Jenny alone long enough to inform her that if she told the social worker the truth, Jenny would join her sister naked in the basement. Jenny then told the social worker that Sylvia had indeed run away. The social worker returned to her office, where she filed a report stating that no more calls needed to be made to the Baniszewski home. Gertrude eventually allowed Sylvia to sleep upstairs, on the condition that she learned not to wet herself. When Gertrude checked Sylvia the next morning and discovered she had wet the bed, Gertrude made her dress, then took her into the living area, where she was once again forced to perform a striptease for her sons and the neighborhood boys, again climaxed by Gertrude forcing Sylvia to masturbate with a Coca-Cola bottle. When Sylvia was finished, she was allowed to dress. After a few moments, apropos of nothing, Gertrude brought up Sylvia's lies about Paula and Stephanie and declared, "You have branded my daughters, so I will brand you." Sylvia was forcibly stripped naked, tied down, and gagged while one of Gertrude's children heated a sewing needle with a series of matches. When the needle was orange, Gertrude used it to carve and burn the letter I and part of the letter M into Sylvia's stomach. She then instructed Ricky Hobbs to continue carving letters to spell out the phrase, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it." Satisfied, Gertrude left the room, leaving Sylvia tied, gagged, and naked. At this point, Hobbs, Paula, and Gertrude's 10-year-old daughter Shirley decided to give Sylvia another tattoo, an S, in the middle of her chest. The three would later become confused as to whether they had intended the S to stand for Sylvia or slave, though the latter explanation was the one which was leaned towards as being correct. Hobbs burned the bottom curve of the S into Sylvia. He then either choked or changed his mind, because he then ordered Jenny to come over and carve the top half. Although threatened, Jenny refused. Hobbs relented and ordered Shirley to finish the tattoo. The 11-year-old choked and accidentally carved the curve backwards so that the numeral 3 appeared on Sylvia's chest. Gertrude re-entered the room at this point to address the still bound and gagged Sylvia. "What are you going to do now, Sylvia? You can't get married now. You can't undress in front of anyone. What are you going to do now?" Sylvia was ungagged to address Gertrude. She replied, "I guess there's nothing I can do. It's on there." That night, Sylvia confided to her sister, "Jenny, I know you don't want me to die, but I'm going to die. I can tell it." The following day, Gertrude woke Sylvia, then forced her to write a letter as she dictated the contents, which were intended to mislead her parents into believing their daughter had run away from the Baniszewski residence. The content of this letter was intended to frame a group of anonymous local boys for extensively abusing and mutilating Sylvia after she had initially agreed to engage in sexual relations with them before they inflicted the extreme abuse and torture upon her body. After Sylvia had written this letter, Gertrude finished formulating her plan to have John Jr. and Jenny blindfold Sylvia, then take her to a nearby wooded area known as Jimmy's Forest and leave her there to die. After she had finished writing the letter, Sylvia was then again tied to the stair railing and offered crackers to eat, although she refused them, saying, "Give it to the dog, I don't want it." In response, Gertrude forced the crackers into Sylvia's mouth before she and John beat her, particularly around the stomach. On the next day, October 24th, Gertrude came into the basement and attempted to bludgeon Sylvia. First, she tried to hit her with a chair, but missed and broke it against the wall. Next, she tried to beat her over the head with a paddle, but swung in such a wide arc that it came back against her own face, blacking her eye. To stop the strange show, Hubbard stepped in and beat Sylvia unconscious with a broomstick. Over the course of that night, and into the morning hours of October 25th, Sylvia beat the basement floor with the scoop portion of an iron shovel. Next-door neighbors would later report considering calling the police, but chose not to. On October 26th, Gertrude voiced her intentions to give Sylvia a warm bath. Stephanie and Hobbs brought Sylvia upstairs and laid her in the tub fully clothed. They took her out shortly thereafter when they realized she was not breathing. Stephanie gave Sylvia CPR, as Gertrude repeatedly shouted to the children in the house that Sylvia was faking her death. Sylvia was 16 years old when she finally succumbed to her injuries. Gertrude then told Hobbs to go to a nearby payphone and call the police. When the police arrived, Gertrude gave them the letter she'd made Sylvia dictate. In the midst of the commotion, Jenny Likens whispered to one of the police, "Get me out of here, and I'll tell you everything." This statement, combined with the police's discovery of Sylvia's body in the basement, prompted the officers to arrest Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, John, Hobbs, and Hubbard for murder. Other neighborhood children present at the time, Mike Monroe, Randy Lepper, Duke, and Cisco, were arrested for injury to a person. Sylvia's body told the whole truth. A child tortured for weeks, murdered by a dozen hands, and a society that watched. The autopsy of Sylvia's body revealed she had suffered in excess of 150 separate wounds across her entire body, in addition to being extremely emaciated at the time of her death. The wounds themselves varied in location, nature, severity, and the stage of healing. Her injuries included burns, severe bruising, and extensive muscle and nerve damage. Her vaginal cavity was almost swollen shut. Moreover, all of Sylvia's fingernails were broken backwards and most of the external layers of skin upon the child's face, breasts, neck, and right knee had peeled or receded. In her death throes, Sylvia had evidently bitten through her lips, partially severing sections of them from her face. The official cause of Sylvia's death was listed by coroner Dr. Arthur Keble as a subdural hematoma due to her receiving a severe blow to her right temple. Both the shock she had primarily suffered due to the severe and prolonged damage inflicted to her skin and subcutaneous tissues, plus the severe malnutrition, were listed as contributory factors to her death. On December 30th, 1965, the Marion County Grand Jury returned first-degree murder indictments against Gertrude and two of her three oldest children, Paula and John Baniszewski Jr. Also indicted were Richard Hobbs and Coy Hubbard. All were charged with having repeatedly struck, beaten, kicked, and otherwise inflicting a culmination of fatal injuries to Sylvia Likens with premeditated malice. 3 weeks prior to the filing of the indictments against the 5 defendants, Stephanie Baniszewski had been released from custody upon a writ of habeas corpus bond, with her attorney successfully contending the state had insufficient evidence to support any murder or culmination of fatal injuries charges against her. Stephanie waived her immunity from any potential impending prosecution while agreeing to testify against her family and any other individuals charged with abusing and murdering Sylvia. The trial of Gertrude, her children Paula and John, Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard began on April 18, 1966. All were tried together before Judge Rabb at Indianapolis's City County Building. Initial jury selection began on this date and continued for several days. The prosecution consisted of Leroy K. New and Marjorie Wessner, who announced their intention to seek the death penalty for all 5 defendants. Paula's time in court was interrupted when she was rushed to the hospital to give birth to the child that she and her mother had insisted she wasn't carrying. In a show of solidarity, Paula named the child Gertrude. Gertrude and the children's cases were exacerbated by the fact that they were being represented by 4 different attorneys, one for Gertrude, one for Paula, one for Hobbs, and one for Coy and John, all of whom worked against each other and attempted to shift blame against the other defendants, even though they were all being tried together. Gertrude's attorney attempted to shift blame onto the children, portraying her as weak, chronically ill, and incapable of preventing or perpetuating any of the abuse. The children's attorneys attempted to shift blame onto Gertrude and the other children. Some of the most damaging testimony against Gertrude was due to her own self-incrimination. She recounted bizarre tales of Sylvia being a neighborhood prostitute and of her trysts with middle-aged, married men, as well as accusing her of frequently starting fights in the home. To corroborate Gertrude's testimony, 11-year-old Marie was called to the stand. Initially, Marie backed up everything her mother had said, until, during cross-examination, she suddenly screamed, "God help me," before admitting everything she'd said was a lie, and went on to recount in graphic, blunt detail how her mother and siblings had tortured and murdered Sylvia. The young girl's shocking turn against her own family was largely responsible for the eventual verdict. Gertrude was found guilty of murder in the first degree. To the shock of the citizens of Indianapolis, she did not receive the death penalty, but rather life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Paula Baniszewski was convicted of second-degree murder. She appealed and was granted a new trial, but before it began, she struck a plea bargain and pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. She served 3 years in prison and was then paroled. John Baniszewski, Hubbard, and Hobbs were all convicted of manslaughter and given 2 to 21-year prison sentences based on the fact that they were minors. The 3 boys were all paroled just 2 years later in 1968. By the time the now 17-year-old Hobbs was released, the severity of his crimes had sunk in, and he suffered a nervous breakdown. He began a regime of heavy chain smoking, which had severely decayed his lungs by the time he was 20. By the time he was 21, he was dead of lung cancer. Gertrude appealed, was granted a new trial and was again found guilty, though this time she was sentenced to 18 years to life. Over the course of the next 18 years, Gertrude became a model prisoner, working in the sewing shop and becoming a den mother to younger female inmates. By the time she came up for parole in 1985, she had earned the prison nickname Mom. The news of Gertrude's parole hearing sent shockwaves through the Indiana community. Jenny Likens and her family appeared on television to speak out against Gertrude. The members of two anti-crime groups, Protect the Innocent and Society's League Against Molestation, traveled to Indiana to oppose Gertrude's parole and support the Likens family, beginning a sidewalk picket campaign. Over the course of 2 months, the groups collected 4,500 signatures from the citizens of Indiana demanding that Gertrude be kept behind bars. In spite of all this, Gertrude was granted parole. During the hearing, she gave the following confession. "I'm not sure what role I had in it, because I was on drugs. I never really knew her. I take full responsibility for whatever happened to Sylvia.
I can't do it, and I'm sorry. That's all I can say. And I ask him to forgive me. That's all I can tell you."
Gertrude walked out of prison on December 4, 1985, and traveled to Iowa under the name Nadine Van Fossen. She died there of lung cancer in 1990. The fates of Gertrude's children remains largely unknown. Bella Baniszewski moved to Iowa and assumed a new identity. Internet rumors claim that she is still alive and lives on a farm somewhere in the Iowa countryside. Stephanie Baniszewski became a school teacher and assumed a new name. John Baniszewski changed his name to John Blake and worked as a truck driver before becoming a real estate agent and lay minister. He was never arrested again. He married and had 3 children, and has lived in anonymity, only surfacing briefly in 1998 in the wake of the Jonesboro massacre to speak for the first time about the Sylvia's murder, saying that he took full responsibility for his role in the murder and that a harsher sentence would have been more just. By now, probably everyone is wondering about her motive. As for Gertrude's motive, it is believed that she was jealous of Sylvia, jealous of her youth, appearance, respectability, and potential. Sylvia's younger sister, Jenny Likens, lived with guilt, trauma, and resilience. She was just 15 when she watched the world destroy her sister. But she never let Sylvia's name fade. She testified. She visited Sylvia's grave yearly. In interviews decades later, she said, "I still wake up hearing her voice. Sometimes, I say her name just to remember she was real." Jenny married, had children, but kept Sylvia's photo beside her bed until the day she died in 2004. And that, my friends, was the story of Sylvia Likens, a haunting reminder of how evil can hide behind everyday walls and wear the face of a caregiver. Gertrude Baniszewski didn't act alone. She bred cruelty, orchestrated silence, and turned children into weapons of destruction. This was more than just a murder. It was a collapse of basic human decency. Sylvia's voice was stolen, but her story speaks louder than ever. As content creator, as viewers, as people, we owe it to her to make sure she's never forgotten. Her pain becomes our responsibility. Her name becomes our lesson. So if you took something away from this case, share it. Talk about it. Remember her. Because awareness is the only antidote to silence, and silence is how monsters thrive. If you found this video insightful, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel for more deep dives into true crime stories.